The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this, the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Awe seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has arisen in our midst. God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and in all the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So I usually begin my day by reading the daily readings for the Mass for that day. The daily readings for weekdays, are organized in this 2-year cycle, so that over the course of 2 years, you read excerpts from most of the major books of the Bible. Though every once in a while, the sequence of readings gets interrupted by a special feast day, and you'll read readings instead that have a particular connection to that day's feast. And one August 28th, several summers ago, I was doing my daily readings, and the cycle was in the middle of the Gospel of Matthew. And then suddenly, on August 28th, the feast of St. Augustine, the normal sequence of readings was interrupted. And the gospel that was inserted was this one that we heard tonight, St. Luke's story of the widow of Nain. I found that curious. Why the widow of Nain on the feast of St. Augustine? What did she have to do with him? So I did a little research, and I'm glad I did, because as it turns out, there's a very cool reason why this gospel is read on the feast of St. Augustine. It's because Augustine himself believed that this gospel captured his own spiritual journey and transformation, which we know from his own hand, as he wrote in the Confessions. The widow of Nain, of course, is a story of a mother who lost her son. And in her grief, she turns to Jesus with tears. The tears of the near inconsolable sorrow of a mother who has just lost her child, and even more, her only child. And Jesus, perhaps alerted to this tragedy by the very sound of his mother's weeping, for all we know, he was just passing through, stops and raises her son from the coffin and restores him to new life and restores her to joy. Augustine saw in this widow of Nain his own mother, St. Monica, who through her tears, disconsolate about how far Augustine seemed from God, raised Augustine from his spiritual death to a new life. In fact, in his Confessions, Augustine even has his mother one-up the widow of Nain. I guess that's fair play. You can always do that with your mom. He writes, "Monica, my mom, shed more tears for my spiritual death than that widow shed for the bodily death of her child." And Augustine believed that God heard his mother's weeping and saved him through her tears, just as Jesus heard the widow's weeping and so raised her son from the dead. But Augustine is willing to go even farther. In one of his sermons on this gospel, he claims that this gospel was written for him. That is to say, Augustine asserts seriously that Luke the evangelist had Augustine in mind some 300 years before Augustine was born, while Luke was composing tonight's gospel. Is Augustine merely being lighthearted about this claim, not meaning for his congregation to take it seriously? I'm not so sure. What happens if we play for a minute with Augustine's notion that this gospel was written specially for him? What if, from the beginning of time, this story was, in some sense, meant for Monica and Augustine? Because if that is true, what else might be true of the Gospels in our own lives? If the Gospels spoke so intimately, so personally to Augustine, that he could claim that they spoke to him about his own life, can't they speak to us in the same way, in the exact same way? Here's a way to think about it. Probably each of us has stored somewhere, in a locked desk drawer, or wedged in a diary, or in an archive folder on your desktop marked personal, a letter or letters from someone who loves you and whom you love, a letter that conveys that love. A letter you find yourself reopening from time to time, year after year. And if it's handwritten, the handwriting itself speaks the name of your friend or your parent or the person who wrote it to you. Or if it's an email, I guess you just look at the from slot to see who wrote it, which is much less romantic. And as you look at the words, you feel your mind focus and you feel your heart open. You can probably read the first line without even looking at the words. And then you just settle in and you let the words of that letter just wash over you. And you revel in those sacred moments. For while you read, you become certain of this, that someone knows you and someone loves you, and you them. We can be almost surprised, flattered, humbled, overwhelmed by how intimately this person who sent this message has come to know us. There are parts of us reflected in these messages that no one else knows, maybe not even ourselves. One of the things I love about such messages is that they kind of enflesh, right before our eyes, the thing we most yearn for in the depth of our souls, which is to be known, to be seen through to our depth, and to be loved. And in turn, to know another in their depth and to love them. I have a letter from my mom that recounts down to the day, hour, and minute when I was born, and the first time I walked, and what I was wearing the day I said my first word, and what room I was in when I said it. We read a letter like that, and we can be overcome by one of the singular joys in all of life, that we're known and just deeply, deeply loved. And I guess what Augustine's claim about the gospel of the widow of Nain forces us to ask is, could you ever dare to believe that God would write such a letter to you? Do we dare to imagine that God might know us, me, you, that intimately, that totally? Surely we all believe that God, being God, does in fact know us that way. But do we dare to believe that God would ever let us know it in such an intimate way? By a word written by God and given to us that we could hold in our own hands and open and read whenever we wished. To be reminded that there is someone out there who knows and loves us to the core and desires our love in return. St. Augustine believed that. I don't believe when Augustine claimed the widow of Nain as his own that he was speaking as a scripture scholar, though of course he was one. He was speaking as a lover, as one who, in his own words, had been seduced, fallen so in love that even in a gospel passage which was surely written to the whole universe, Augustine found in it God, his lover, whispering the secrets of his own life into the deepest recesses of his soul. Augustine didn't just read the scriptures. He allowed the scriptures to read him, to make sense of his own life, to give him images and stories and words that took all the most intimate tangles and knots of his life, and they were many, and showed him a way through. Are we willing to entertain the possibility that the Gospels might be so intimately concerned with your life? Augustine was. Jesus was. Remember, Jesus sat in synagogue that one day and opened the scroll of Isaiah and found in the so ancient words written there that one will come and he will bring glad tidings to the poor, proclaim liberty to captives, give sight to the blind. Jesus read those words, written centuries before he was born, and recognized there a letter written to him by God. Jesus read words that day in the synagogue in Nazareth, just like we do whenever we pick up the scriptures, like Augustine did when he picked up the scriptures, written centuries before our birth. And Jesus discovered in them a knowledge about himself that perhaps not even he had dared to fathom yet. This perhaps is what we mean when we say that the scriptures are a living word. To read the scriptures is to ingest the most life-giving vitamins or the most healing medicine. When we eat a vitamin or swallow medicine, we have no problem thinking that those things enter into us and start to change us and transform us, to strengthen and heal us. Tonight's gospel and Augustine's reading of it invite us to think of reading the scriptures in just the same way. For the scriptures, like Jesus by that dead boy's coffin outside the city of Nain, touch the walls that have deadened our hearts and say, arise, get up. You are known and you are loved all the way to life eternal.